Hi, welcome. I'm Barbara Ware, and I really appreciate you joining us. I'm the Director of Communications for Center for Internet Security. I'd just like to mention that we recently transitioned from the name Center for Internet Security to CIS. I mention that because you'll hear during this briefing people's titles, and when you hear CIS, it's simply the acronym for Center for Internet Security. I know some people's time is limited, and because of that, I want to tell you now that my email is Barbara, B-A-R, W-A-R-E, @CISecurity.org. And as the Director of Communications for Center for Internet Security, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions after this briefing and even entertain thoughts that you may have of future briefings that would be of interest to you. Our website is www.cisecurity.org. Our rundown in brief you will be hearing comments from our panelists Curtis Duke, Kathleen Pattentrager, Tony Sager, in that order, and we'll also have time for Q&A, which I hope will be about the last 20 or 25 minutes of this hour. I have two small program changes. Adam Montville, the CIS VP of Programs, since he's on business travel, will be available simply for Q&A. We're also fortunate enough to have Edward Alexandian, the CIS Program Manager for Business Development, available for our Q&A session. And now I'd like to introduce Curtis Dukes, the Executive VP and GM, Best Practices in Automation Group for CIS. Next slide.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, my name is Kurt Dukes, and I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the Center for Internet Security. We are a nonprofit company. We were founded in October of 2000 with the single goal of helping all organizations to improve cybersecurity. In 2015, we also merged with the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center into one organization, still keeping the name Center for Internet Security. I really wanted to talk about the security benchmarks and the controls, and we're going to have that done by both Kathleen and by Tony Sager. Even though we were founded here in the United States, we believe that we all have a shared problem, and there is no border when it comes to cyber attacks. And so the guidance that we create and promulgate as free PDF downloads is available to anyone that has internet access to our website. Why should you listen to us? Well, simply because we are a global volunteer community. Yes, there are approximately 100 employees with the Center for Internet Security, but we really leverage the talents of an international volunteer community. They're the ones that actually help us create the security benchmarks and also work with Tony and company when it comes to developing the critical security controls. Both benchmarks and controls are continuously updated. In fact, you'll hear from Tony that we are about to launch an update of the critical security controls version 6, moving to version 7 for that. One key aspect of this for us is that we take threat information from a multitude of sources, and we've developed an attacker's lifecycle attack model. And we use that to actually understand how attackers are attempting to attack us. And then from that, we develop the critical controls that would disrupt that attacker's life cycle in that regard. So that's a good feedback loop that we use to continuously update both the benchmarks and also the controls in that regard. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to introduce Kathleen Pattentrager, who will talk to you about the security benchmarks.
Thanks, Kurt. This is Kathleen, and I wanted to talk more about the benchmarks. Our benchmarks, CIS benchmarks, are recommended technical control rules and values that are used to harden operating systems, middleware, software, and applications, as well as network devices. They're well-defined and unbiased because they're consensus-based recommendations that are built from the industry or that are given to the industry as best practices, but built by organizations across the globe. And we have over 140 secure configuration guidelines covering 14 technology groups. One of the things that makes our benchmarks unique is that these recommendations are defined by a consensus workflow process. That includes hundreds of security professionals worldwide. Our benchmarks are used by thousands of enterprises, and that includes over 1,200 actual benchmarks members, and in addition to thousands of other organizations that download our benchmarks for free. We do have those published on our website, and they can be downloaded at no charge. Some of the other resources that are available with our benchmarks include our secure configuration benchmarks that are integrated with our CIS controls. We have taken the controls and we have mapped those to the configuration guidelines so that you can see how they are integrated and how they work together and what they are meant to accomplish. We also have a SysCap Pro tool, which is a configuration and assessment tool that includes a dashboard that can be used to inspect the devices that you're taking a look at with this automated tool. There is also remediation content, and by that I mean automated content that is used to build secure devices. That can be customized, and some of the settings can be changed to your own policies within your own organization. That's done through our workbench, our CIS workbench. In the workbench, a lot of work goes on, including the workflow to actually develop our benchmarks. Member resources that I'm talking about from both the controls and the benchmarks are available to our communities in the workflows, in the workbench. And all of the rationale behind every single setting can be found in Workbench so that you can understand why the recommendations that are in our settings are being made. We also have a consensus security metrics guide that was developed a few years ago and that we are in the process of taking a look at to update, and that will help you to understand how to measure the security in your organization using our benchmarks and our controls. So I'd like to turn it over to Tony Sager. Tony will talk to us about the CIS controls.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. I appreciate it. Yes, and I'm Tony Sager with the Center for Internet Security, CIS, and I've been involved in what we now call the cybersecurity business for well over 40 years now, so I've had a chance to see a lot of things happen. You know, Kurt gave a nice introduction to the controls and what we're trying to do, and they stem from a couple of very simple ideas. So having spent my life in security testing for the government, working with partners in the private sector, seeing this problem around the world, one observation was really clear to me in the early 2000s, was that we are seeing the same problems over and over and over again. So it's not like we're seeing millions of new attacks every day. We're seeing millions of repeats of the same attacks every day. And it's because they work. And it's not because people that are involved in cyber defense don't care or they aren't lazy. I think it's mostly because they are overwhelmed. It's not a theoretically hard problem as much as it is what we would call an operationally hard problem. There's so many things to deal with, so many challenges, so many tools. The term we use for that at CIS is the fog of more. We have more tools, more threat feeds, more information, more training, more frameworks than we've ever had in the history of cyber defense, and yet the problem seems to be getting harder, not easier. And so the idea of the controls, you know, when I was doing this for the federal government and I started speaking about the issue publicly, the most frequent question I got repeatedly was, what do I do first? And you know, I had kind of standard answers that I would give. Well, you need to focus on this and that, but people were really looking for something straightforward, prescriptive, and specific to get going on. Where do I spend my first dollar? What do I get my boss's attention on first? What should I train my people to do first? And there's a temptation in our business to try and solve the entire problem in one meeting or in one document. And I realized that we needed to simplify the way we thought about the problem, help people prioritize and focus on the things that really were the most important to do, both because not dealing with them caused us lots of damage, but also the things that would allow us to build a good foundation for solid defense. So that's the historical origin of the CIS controls. So starting in about year 2008 or so, a simple idea which really started with a handful of friends around the room and a very simple list of things has grown into the project that we now call the CIS controls. So think of the CIS controls as not a competing or alternate regulatory framework, but a set of prioritized actions. That is, Kurt mentioned this volunteer workforce that supports both the benchmarks and controls. So think of it as crowdsourcing or bringing together lots of people that have a common interest in the security of the internet and the way we use technology, putting their heads together to both understand the problem and translate it into positive action. So that's what the controls are really all about. On the slide in front of you, you see a graphical representation the way we show it in a picture. You can get all the information later, and Barbara will be happy to provide you with links and references later. They have taken off in large scale in terms of popularity and support. We're in the range of 80,000 downloads of the current version. A significant percentage, I believe about a third, come from outside the United States. The basic content that we create, again, through primarily volunteer labor, is available for a free download. That is this valuable content created by people that most of us cannot afford to hire or that we couldn't even find if we wanted to, are able to create this. We turn it into a supported product that goes out to the public. Some of the other things that were mentioned, how do we support a nonprofit company, which at least needs to have some income? We do it through a membership model. Some of that was referenced by Kathleen, and membership gets you additional content, support, tools, and so forth. But the content itself, the basic ideas, are in the public. And we've created what I would call an ecosystem around the idea. So it's not good enough to just create a list of things to do. And you can find lots of lists to do all throughout the industry, all around the world. And some of the lists are short, some are gigantic, some are very prescriptive and detailed, and some are very general and wide-ranging. But there's all kinds of things around there. But the idea is that we need more than a list. We need a way to help people achieve the things that the list wants. So we have created a wide variety of products around the idea. A couple of examples are there: small and medium-sized businesses, help for auditors, etc. And let's go on to the next slide, please. And so we have a variety of things that we produce from CIS, again, primarily by gathering volunteers. Some of them we call companion guides. So executive summaries. We've done a lot of work in the last several months on privacy as an important companion. So we often get focused on the technical solutions, but almost anything you do in cyberspace requires collecting information, assigning privilege or rights for people to access information, combining information from multiple places. So you need a way to think about, as you design your technical defenses, what are the privacy implications? What are the things that we should be thinking about? And of course, there are a lot of variables in that question, both by nation, by culture, by industry. So it's not simple to keep all these in mind, but we've produced some additional documentation, again, written by some of the top experts that we could find, to put together their heads, think about, as you implement technology and defenses, what should you be thinking about in terms of the privacy implications of that content. So these kinds of complementary products are a big part of what we do. We have a strong interest among our community in this problem of very small to medium-sized businesses. As we all know, there aren't enough trained people to go around in this business, and many, especially small businesses, are just overwhelmed by the problem. They do not have professional security staff. They do not have the ability to spend large amounts of money on consultants or on very high-end enterprise-class tools. So they are struggling mightily with just understanding what to do. So we have taken some of our materials, which have been aimed at a sort of classic IT security and operations, and simplifying them, cutting them down to kind of the minimum, rewriting them in the simplest language that we can develop, and starting now to distribute new products that are intended for this target audience. We'll also produce information soon that will help those that, one issue is, even if security tools were free, many small businesses couldn't use them because they don't have the professional staff to actually run things or install them or tune them. So they will instead attempt to purchase or outsource this problem through service providers and other means to really turn either their IT and or their security operations over to someone else. So we need to then help people become smarter buyers, to think about the kind of contracts, the kind of wording, the kind of deliverables that should be a part of those contracts to help them with that kind of problem. So we have a whole range of these kind of complementary products that are really, I think, essential to moving from having a good list of things to do to helping people achieve the kinds of things that were intended on the list. Kurt mentioned briefly what I call the CIS community attack model. And this is our way of prioritizing and making sense of the challenge that's out there. So the original model that became the CIS controls was developed the way most things are in this business. It was 5 people sitting around a table thinking about the problem and exchanging ideas until they agreed on a small number of things. And the challenge I gave that group was no one leaves the room until we all agree on a small number of things, as compared to trying to solve the entire problem in one meeting. What I wanted to do was help people get started and to deal with the majority of the problem and the foundational things that would help them improve, and not get hung up in lists of thousands of things to do, which, again, people find overwhelming. So the original model of the control is very simple: 5 friends, we argued, and the discipline in this process is not adding things to the list, it's keeping the list short, right? Because security people are often very clever, and they love to add new things to the list of things to do. So the discipline is to try and cut it back, prioritize on the things that are most important. And a great deal of what those people focused on was really about their specific knowledge of attacks. Again, security people are great at speculating about all the bad things that might happen to you someday. I wanted them to focus on what is happening to us today, this repeat of the same kinds of problems over and over again. What should we foundationally, fundamentally be doing to deal with that problem? So that group of 5 friends produced a very short list. That got adopted by a company called the SANS Institute, which is, I think, worldwide the largest teacher of cybersecurity. They turned it from 5 friends into 5,000 friends on the mailing list. So lots of companies and individuals contributing to the idea. We took that over, I took that over actually after I retired from the government, and turned it into a nonprofit, which is now part of the Center for Internet Security. So we evolved it from sort of 5 friends, trust their judgment, to lots of friends. It's still about their judgment and experience. And then we've been formalizing it ever since. So the next stage is about working with what I would call the authoritative summaries of attacks that are found throughout the industry. The most popular, at least in the United States, comes from a company called Verizon. And they produce every year an annual summary of data breaches, that is, losses of information, as seen in their business, as well as, I think, 50 or more contributing partners. And these people put all their information together on the kind of attacks they have seen, the losses incurred, and Verizon does a great job of summarizing all this, analyzing it, looking for trends, trying to categorize the kinds of attacks, and so forth. and sort of make sense of the problem and present it in a way so that individuals don't have to read tens of thousands of pages of information, but instead can focus on the summary. And then for the last several years, what we do from CIS is work with the Verizon folks to map this summary of what they are seeing, that is the summary of the problem, into what we think are the smallest number of effective defensive actions or controls that would allow you to deal with that problem. For example, the benchmarks in this context are really one of those controls. That is, you can get a lot of defensive value, stop lots of specific attacks through good choices of system configuration. And so we put that information together. We work with Verizon, but we also work with now another large handful of companies that have similar kinds of information. And I think we have commitments from quite a few more companies who have these, I'll say, kind of annual summaries of information, and work with them to look again at their categories, summaries, and trends, and map them into the control set. So the idea is to start making more and more formality to the way we look at the problem. And then this attack model is the next stage that we're now putting in place, which is really about, if we're going to talk to a dozen different companies or several dozen companies, we run into a different problem of language and categorization. That is, every one of these companies uses a different words to describe the same thing. So there's a lot of manual labor to try and map from one to the other. So the idea is to standardize that, have a common model of what attackers are doing, and map from that into the controls. And that's the notion of the attack model. As Kurt mentioned, the idea has been around in numerous forms. Most is best known through something called the Lockheed Martin kill chain. But there are many models like that, and I've studied all that I can find for the last several years and tried to compose them into something that makes sense for those of us that are really consumed by this problem of mapping into controls or countermeasures. So in addition then to the sort of the controls, the complementary products, and the model behind them, again, this is about more than just having a list. So we're entering an era now where everyone has to deal with multiple security frameworks or regulations or reporting requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And so the critical controls don't stand alone, right? We all have to deal with, and some of the acronyms are things like ISO and COBIT and FISMA, and these are all, various levels of legal or regulatory or reporting frameworks that we all have to deal with. And our studies say that almost every company now has to deal with more than one at a time. So it's not because a company may process credit cards, it may handle medical data, there may be privacy implications to what they do, they may have security of data storage requirements. And so it's hard enough to do the work of security, but now you have to report to multiple parties what you have done so that those auditors or regulators or so forth are satisfied that you've done the right thing. And so it's more important than ever to be able to focus on the solution part and handle the reporting part in the most cost-effective way possible. So that's the idea of this assessment and mapping tools. And a number of volunteers for us have produced tools to map the critical controls into all of these kinds of frameworks that we can find. And so that's how we keep those current through volunteer labor. So we're very conscious of, even if you do the right things, if you follow our advice and you implement them, you still need to demonstrate to others that you have done the right thing. And those others could include lawyers, auditors, insurance companies, regulators, and they all have a different way of talking about or thinking about the problem. Therefore, you want to be able to translate the technical steps and the procedural steps you have taken into their language. And that's what this whole business of mapping is all about. And finally, I'll mention controls measurement. This is, I think, an essential part of the maturation of cybersecurity across the entire industry, is that focusing on measurement so that we know where we are, so that we know when we are making positive progress, so that we can negotiate with supply chain partners, et cetera, et cetera. These are all essential elements to the growth and maturation of the cybersecurity business. And we are making that a big part of the next version of the controls. We have built it into the current version, but we have a couple of big steps in mind that we think will make that much more sort of immediately usable, much more implementable in automated tools and so forth. And then finally, as Kurt mentioned, we're just starting the process now of building the version 7 of the controls, which is a multi-month process for us. We've assembled world-class volunteers. We have a social media platform in which to manage the discussions. We have brought together, as Kathleen mentioned, the benchmarks, brain power and volunteer pool to complement what we've done traditionally in the past with the controls. And we've built, I think, a great starting point. We've been collecting feedback for years now about what people find useful and sometimes not as useful about the controls. We've got great feedback from the vendor community as to how they are using the controls now, and we're better able to design them up front so that there are automation tools available, measurement tools, assessment tools, reporting tools, et cetera. We want there to be a thriving marketplace built around this idea so that, again, people can take the intent of the controls and really do something with them. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. That's been a bit of a whirlwind tour, and let me summarize on behalf of the CIS team. Our thanks for joining us today, and we're doing this because we think this is really an important part of the growth of cybersecurity and its role that it plays in keeping us all safe in a world that is so deeply interconnected. So as was mentioned earlier, there's no border here. This is about improving security for everyone in the most scalable, cost-effective, universal way that we can. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Barbara to take on the questions and answers, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I'd like to call upon the participants if they have questions. This would be a good time. You could direct them to the panelists, would be ideal. Feel free to enter any questions you may have. And while I give participants a few moments to do that, there are two that have come in. First of all, someone asked, are CIS controls and CIS benchmarks required by government? Tony, would you like to handle that, or Kurt?
I'd be happy to start, Barbara. This is Tony. Yeah, again, the controls don't, in and of themselves, have any regulatory power or legal standing. They're created by volunteers, supported by the nonprofit, and then distributed around, freely around the world. The authority that they have is in the eyes of the adopter, right? So we have many adoptions by lots of individual enterprises and support vendors. You'll find the controls in things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, in places like the National Governors Association's planning, in ANISA and some European standards and so forth. And so, it's really intended as a grassroots kind of mass market movement that can help people deal with these other frameworks. Again, our surveys say that it's very, very common for people to be enterprises to be dealing with multiple frameworks. And we often find that people use the controls as a way to manage or prioritize within some other framework. For example, ISO 27000 or PCI for credit card processing in the US, et cetera. They have to deal with that as a requirement. They use the controls as a way to get started and prioritize their actions and then report internally. Anything you could add, Kurt?
Yes, Tony. I would also add that within Europe, the Network and Information Systems Directive also calls out the controls. They do that through the European Technical Standards Institute technical reports, where there is a reference to that. So we are trying to be more expansive than just here in the U.S., and so we are looking at international standards organizations and also talking about the efficacy of the controls within those standards organizations. And now we're seeing that reflected in directives that have been adopted by the European Parliament.
Great. I have another question here. That is, does the CIS controls address data protection? Tony, could you start off with the answer to that?
Sure. Yeah, they're found throughout the controls, and data protection is inherent in sort of any defensive framework. It needs to start with understanding the data that you have and trying to understand, identify, and manage data that is more critical rather than less critical to the success of the mission or the enterprise. So included in the controls is thinking about the criticality of information itself, and then how to protect it. And then at many levels, you deal with data protection in terms of the storage, the kind of everything from the cryptographic techniques used to scramble or hide the data to make it unreadable, but also to manage access to the data through administrative privilege and the rights that are assigned to humans and processes that operate on the network. So there's no one sort of requirement in there. It's inherent throughout the way that we think about data. There's also the, it's hard to separate. They are not identical, but closely linked are the issues around privacy as well as around sort of data protection in general, and specifically around encryption. So again, they're not equivalent, but you have to think about both at the same time. And often your mechanisms to ensure privacy include a healthy dose of the cryptographic and the protection of data itself. So this is sort of inherent in the way you think about defense and the way you talk about the controls. And it is a very complicated world, though, to deal with these things, right? Because the purpose of data is to use it, which often means share it, and then sort of managing the way that you present, move data, store it, and so forth. I will also say that the controls take, I think, a little different approach than many frameworks, at least traditional frameworks, do. There's a notion of, if I just want to identify the super critical information on this network, and I'll protect that really, really tightly. And to do that, of course, I got to figure out what is that information, where is it, how is it moved, where is it stored, which pieces of IT get to handle it, and so forth. My experience is that almost everyone gets that wrong. That is, information is so ubiquitous and free-flowing, and its uses are not bounded, that it's almost impossible to figure out what is critical and to neatly partition that off from everything else. And in fact, we see through things like the big attacks on Sony America and other sort of content providers, that things that we would not have identified ahead of time as critical turn out to be damaging to a company's reputation or to its operations. So the controls take an approach that say, you know what, all information deserves at least some level of protection. We really ought to, it doesn't mean everything gets an identical amount of protection. It means that when in doubt, information should be protected, because you can't always predict what is going to be important to the outcome or the reputation of a business. And it's almost impossible to bound where information is stored or how it's moved or who has access to it. In other words, if you do that sort of careful analysis up front, you can almost expect to be wrong. And therefore, you need to make sure that you've erred on the side of protection rather than sort of agonized over, did I identify the 10% or 20% or whatever that is really super critical. So thanks, Barb.
So at this time, if I asked my staff in East Greenbush, New York, if they don't see any other questions, I'd like to just ask if my panelists, Kurt, Kathleen, out of Montville, if you've joined us, if you have anything to add to this conversation before we end this briefing.
Hi, Barbara. This is Kurt. Yeah, on that last question, I would just point out that the controls would be one tool or one mechanism that could be used to help with the upcoming general data protection requirement within the European Union. It becomes effective, I believe, in 2018. And so to demonstrate compliance to the GDPR, you could use implementation of the controls as one mechanism for that. So I think it fits nicely within that, and it also, as Tony's illustrated, it also helps with other regulatory frameworks.
Well, great. And on that note, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to thank everyone for participating and just show you the next slide as a reminder. My name again, my contact information, the CIS website alone is just www.cisecurity.org. How to reach me by cell. And feel free to offer any commentary on today's briefing and suggestions for the future. We look to have this be an ongoing thing that we do every once in a while to kind of address the changing world that we live in. Thank you for participating. Take care.